Hey friends, so a tutorial request that I get fairly often is help with the ability to bring the arms up overhead in something like handstand. Overhead flexion of the shoulder, and how that can be a challenge for a lot of people. Now, even if you're not working on something like handstand, this can be helpful for downward facing dog, or even if you're not even involved in yoga and you're looking at lifting heavy weights up overhead and perhaps trying to minimize rib cage flare, spinal extension, or be able to bring the arms a little bit closer together in more of an externally rotated position, which perhaps may be a bit safer for the shoulder girdle over time. This is a really complex move, overhead flexion of the shoulder. And I know it's confusing because a lot of times in yoga we say something like, extend the arms up overhead. And there's nothing innately wrong with that language. However, when you get into anatomy terms, it can be a little bit confusing because extension of the shoulder is back this way. And this is overhead flexion, but I digress. Bringing the arms up overhead is about 180 degrees of the shoulder. And that is, for a lot of people, about the max. So please know already, if you're struggling with overhead flexion of the shoulder and you find that you're really extending and expanding through the rib cage, externally rotating, or you're in extension in the spine, or perhaps you have to bring your arms wide, or even internally rotate them a little bit, please know that this is a hard thing. And it could be hard for so many reasons, whether it's your bony structure, your muscles. A lot of people have a lot of musculature up here on the shoulders, front, back, sides. It could just be how you've been moving in the past. So this is going to be slow going. And when we work with the shoulders, we never want to force the shoulders because they are a complex set of joints. There's many things involved. And we just want to be careful because, again, getting that straight line in handstand, probably not as important as being able to just use our shoulder for normal everyday life things, so without pain, right? So today, let's talk a little bit about how we can use some passive flexibility and also a little bit of active mobility to get into this overhead flexion position while being mindful of the ribs and mindful of extension of the spine. Now, naturally, bringing the arms up overhead, the arms go through something called scapulohumeral rhythm, or the motion of the humerus and the scapula, the shoulder blade, working together to bring the arms into this position, right? Because they both move together. So when that happens and they're moving on the rib cage, there will be some expansion. We call it rib flare in yoga, spinal extension. You can call it thoracic extension, although you're never really going into full extension. In thoracic, you're just decreasing out of flexion a little bit, right? So there's a lot of things in play. So we won't be able to completely minimize this rib cage flare. However, you know, when sometimes we see people and when they bring the arms overhead, in order to do that, they have to be here, which if you're going into something like handstand is going to be hard for a lot of reasons. You're not going to be able to make that straight line. And also when you're in this flared position or the scissor position, as we call it, of the ribs and the pelvis, it's going to be a lot harder to maintain core control, which is pretty important for something like handstand and definitely important if we're progressing into transitions like lowering into crow pose or something like that. And I'm going to guess, although I don't lift heavy weights, that you probably want to have some integration of the core and a little bit more of that box position of the ribs and the pelvis if you're lifting hella weight over your head too, right? And that's just a guess. So again, there's a lot of complex tissue on the shoulder, and they all come to meet on the shoulder. So in the front, we have kind of the pecs, and then we have the delts capping, and then on the back, the triceps and the lats are feeding up into the shoulder, and they can just, everything can get a little bunched up in there, right? So a nice way to start for this, and even if you're not a huge fan of myofascial release and you don't necessarily believe in the long-term changes of it, totally fine. I like myofascial release more for the neuromuscular connection with the body. So what's happening? Can I connect my brain to that muscle? And maybe I can get a little bit of short-term mobility and movement freed up because my brain is now telling my nervous system, like, okay, it's safe, we can soften, we can let go of our hold a little bit, and then maybe we can move a little bit more in the short term. And if we're working on handstand or something in the short term, this might be useful for us. So I come to lay on my side with the block on the medium setting. And the sharp edge of the block is going to hit not in my armpit, but maybe 2 inches below. 2 inches below my armpit, it's going to be right around serratus anterior, or the feather-like muscles that come on the side of your rib cage and help with protraction. We're not necessarily after those today, but you might be like, wow, that's intense if you've never worked on these before. So you can play with those a little bit, just trying to soften in. You can always put a blanket on top. But if you have tightness more in the front of your shoulder, so if you're going to lift your arms up overhead and you feel that there's more restriction here in the front of the shoulder, well, we can tip forward. You can back up a little bit on the block, and then you can tip forward, kind of getting into the meat of some of the pec attachments here. Now it's up to you. I like compression or stillness, about a 5 or 6 on this discomfort scale, and staying for a few breaths before I move somewhere else. Some people like a little bit more of a movement motion. If you feel more restriction on the back of the shoulder, when you lift the arms up overhead, well, come closer to the front of the block and then rock back from that position, hitting more of the lat attachment, which for some people, if probably maybe not too many yogis, although you never know, can be the source of some tightness. So finding a little bit of compression here or some rocking and rolling motions here. And just taking the time to explore all this tissue that leads up into the shoulder and could possibly restrict some of your movement. Once you've done that on both sides, and you've noted if there's any differences, because it's also very normal to have differences on both sides, let's look at how we can both passively and actively get into this overhead flexion position. So I like to start with a little bit more of a passive stretch, and that is just shoulder circles with a strap. And the strap is helpful because it gives you something to pull against. It gives you a little bit of tension. You can't really tell what you're doing if you're just bringing your arms up overhead. And while this is a nice way to start, notice when I'm doing this, my rib cage is moving a little bit to kind of compensate. And again, we're not going to get completely rid of that, but it's interesting to slow this down and to add a strap into place. So starting with the strap about 3 feet or so apart, micro bend in the elbows. Actually, look at your elbows. Can you see the bend in them? Start the external rotation right away. So as if you're kind of hugging a block between your elbows, micro bend, and pull in the strap just a little bit, 10% pressure. And then think about what's happening with your ribs and your pelvis here. Because as most of us sit naturally, we're going to go into that scissor position. The ribs are going to come forward, and the pelvis is going to tip into anterior tilt. So can you think about an exhale, or what would happen if someone was about to sucker punch you? The pelvis would go posterior, or at least slightly, and the rib cage would sink in because the core would be engaged. So we want to think about keeping all of that while we circle the arms and not really losing that, because the tendency here would be to bring the arms up overhead, to get to a place where we feel stuck, and then either blast out through the ribs and the spine or blast out through the elbows. Not everyone's hypermobile like me. But again, there's nothing innately wrong with that. Some people can do that without damage for a long time. However, if we're trying to target the shoulders, we need to kind of pull back a little bit. So find the box position by taking a sharp exhale. I like to do that through the mouth. It makes it louder and more dramatic. Tilt the pelvis down into posterior. So lift up through the pubic bone, squeeze the sit bones together, soften the low ribs. And you can do that while still sitting tall. Just instead of lifting up through the sternum, you're thinking about lifting up through the crown. Then take your strap, micro bend your elbows. Nothing moves below your arms, and bring the arms up overhead. Don't force the shoulders. When you get to a space that feels like it's the end range of motion for you, stay there and breathe. And maybe on a little exhale, you squeeze your shoulder blades lightly together and you get a little bit more movement. There's no need to pass it through, and there's no point in blasting through if that's all you're doing through the elbows. You want to think about slowly moving into a space where you can breathe. And if you're like, I have really flexible shoulders already, that's not helping me. Well, you can start in a really small space, and then you will definitely get to a spot where you can't pass through. Just to stay there and focus on the exhale position, micro bend, pulling the strap apart, squeeze the shoulder blades together. Do not worry about the shoulders coming up by the ears. Again, that's part of scapular humeral rhythm. The shoulders want to come up by the ears. So that cue in yoga about dragging the shoulders down the back body when your arms are overhead, forget about it. Let's not do it. Not helpful for the shoulders. In fact, very unhelpful. Does not have this nice golf ball of the humerus sitting in the T of the glenohumeral joint. No. So again, taking your time to go slow with circles. You don't have to go all the way down, however you can. Maybe after you've done a few, you find, I can move my hands in another inch or so. And once you've done, 15, 20 slow circles, it's time to let go of that, roll them around a little bit, and get on to our next thing. So let's do another passive drill before we introduce an active, but we're going to change this one a little bit as well. So there's puppy pose, right? We've all done puppy pose, whether it's at the wall or the floor. I'll show the floor. And what happens in puppy? We take the arms out in front of us and we just blast down. And maybe yours doesn't look like this, maybe it's here. But look at my butt. It's just kind of flaring up. My pelvis is tipping forward. My ribs are flaring. I'm not really doing much for my shoulders. Maybe I'm internally rotating them to try to get a little bit more space. But that's not necessarily what I'm going for. So instead, back out of this. Bring the hands back. Set the hips over the knees. You don't have to go into posterior tilt here, but lengthen into more of a neutral. Take an exhale. Lift up through the rib cage. I like to come on fingertips to make this a little bit more active. Hug your fingers towards the midline. Wing your elbows wide. And then wrap them towards the middle of the mat like you're hugging a block between the forearms. And then we can slowly start to lower the chest. But keep thinking about that exhale position. To pull the low ribs in. Maybe you need to spider the fingers forward. Keep at least a micro bend in the elbows. It's going to make it much harder. Try to keep the hips back over the knees.
Exhale, hug the ribs in, lengthen the tailbone down, pull your navel in and up. Maybe you walk the fingers forward a little bit more. Squeeze them towards the midline. You might as well work the wrists at the same time. Squeeze, squeeze, squeeze. Micro bend your elbows. Are you cheating yourself? Pull your navel in, take an exhale. So that's modified puppy, not nearly as fun as regular puppy. Okay. Looking at a little bit more of an active mobility or using your own muscles to pull you into this. Let's take a peek at grown-ups pose. You can do this with or without blocks. If you're really tight to start, I recommend doing it without blocks because the blocks are going to make it a little bit more challenging. And that is coming into child's pose with your arms on the blocks. And you decide where it's comfortable to have your arms on the blocks. Some people like their elbows. Some people like closer to their hands. The forehead rests on the floor. I'm going to take this off for this. Forehead rests on the floor. And you just try to sink down, keeping the hips as much in contact with the heels as you can. Now, let's bring a little bit of integration to the arms. So think about reaching away from you. Let the shoulders come up by the ears. Think about externally rotating or spiral the pinkies in, but do that from the upper arm more than the ribs, or more than the wrists, sorry. From here, this is a pretty passive pose. Let's bring a little bit of activity to it. First, think about the position of the ribs and pelvis. Take a sharp exhale. Notice how that changes things. Maybe your ribs lift away from your thighs slightly as your sit bones come closer. Can you maintain that? A light pressure of the forehead into the mat. This should not feel like a lot in the neck. Keep the external rotation and micro bend of the arms and hover the right arm off of the block. You could see how if there was no block, this would be a little bit easier because you would be on the floor and you wouldn't have to hover it as high. And then release. And then the left arm off the block. And release. You can do this on a sharp exhale. Right arm, lower. Left arm. And of course, you can do both arms at the same time, with or without the block, forehead on the floor. Lift, 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 lift. Using the muscles of your arms and your shoulders and your back to pull you into that position of overhead flexion. There's a similar but more accessible variation of this pose to do in locust on your belly. So traditional locust pose, you might lift everything up or come here or come here. You could do a locust variation where you just lift up through the arms with the forehead down on the floor. So thinking about pushing down through the pubic bone, set your pelvis and your ribs here. Don't cheat yourself. Take that exhale. Think about external rotation of the arms. Tone the glutes. Squeeze them a little bit. We want some hip extension. And then you can practice lifting one arm, lifting other arm, or lifting both arms with the forehead lightly on the floor. If both arms lift, you can think about pulsing them, slight pulses up, 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 while keeping the position of the ribs and the pelvis. So that's going to help you work a little bit against gravity. Last but not least, a feel-good stretch. I've done a demo of this in a lot of detail on one of my past videos, so I'm going to go over it really quickly here. But this is going to help with the triceps, the shoulders, as well as the back, which can help some of the tightness as well. That's going to contribute to not allowing that overhead flexion. So take a block, long setting, base of the wrist at the base of the block. You're going to need to find the wall here, and I apologize for the angle, it's not going to be the best. Take the block up and behind you, hug your elbows in as much as you can, and they may start to display out depending on the tightness, but we're going to try to work them towards the midline, try to find that tricep wrap, right? And then you're going to place your elbows right where the wall and the floor meet. Walk, 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 walk. The block may awkwardly touch the wall. It's not going to be flat yet. That's fine. It's not a problem. Tuck your toes. This is not about the hamstring, so don't worry about straightening the legs as you lift the knees. Hug your elbows towards the midline. Your head may or may not touch. Again, not important. Keep the legs super bent and walk the feet in. As you walk the feet in, the block will press more into the upper and the mid-back. It is not on my neck. That's why the hand position was really important at the beginning. And keeping the compression of the belly to the thighs. I walk in, hug my elbows in. This is such a lovely stretch. And different people are going to feel this in different places. So you might feel it in the back of the arms. You may feel it more in the armpit. You may just feel it in the back. I feel it mostly in the back here. But it's a really nice stretch. And you can decide whether you need that at the beginning, at the end, or in the middle as a feel-good stretch. And I think the most important thing here is spending time on the shoulders. So if you know that those are really tight for you, and you're doing a home practice, definitely spending a good 10-15 minutes warming up the shoulders with a variety of active and passive work before you get into something like handstand so that you can achieve a little bit more of that line and hopefully then be able to find that exhale position of the ribs and the pelvis. Hope that helped.